But yes, I'm Liza Weinstein. I'm one of the 5 editors of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. And for those of you who may be less familiar with IJURR, with the journal, I don't think many of you are, but if you are, I just want to say a little bit about the IJURR as a forum for intellectual debate, that we see ourselves at the forefront of urban and regional research. The journal is committed to linking rigorous theoretical development with empirical work and sustaining high standards of critical scholarship. Embracing the multidisciplinary approach that we've been engaging with over the past couple of days, IJURR brings together key contributions from sociology, geography, political science, anthropology, planning, and related fields, and it has long been essential reading for social scientists concerned with complex and changing roles and the future of cities and regions. And this is my opportunity to put in a plug for you to submit the papers that you've presented at the conference to IJURR. We would love to see your work. We have been impressed with the work that we've been engaging with over the past few days, and so please do submit. So of all of the activities that IJURR is involved with and engaged with, our collaborations with RC21 are among the most meaningful and important to us. The doctoral school and this annual IJURR lecture and the RC21 conference in general embodies the close, long-standing relationship between the journal and the RC21 community. And they reflect our shared commitment to nurturing critical urban and regional research and supporting scholars at various career stages. As next year is going to mark IJURR's 50th anniversary, we've been thinking quite a bit about our history and our common roots together growing out of this RC, and how meaningful it is to be able to celebrate with this community in this, every other year lecture and in forums like this, and the shared history and commitment to the political project of building a critical intellectual community that brings together so many people from so many parts of the world and from so many places to build urban theory and practice from our shared learning and our situated vantage points. So I want to take this opportunity to thank the co-presidents of RC21, Alberta Andrati and Claire Colomb, for the work that they've put in over these past 3 years, sustaining this vibrant intellectual community. So let's take a moment and just thank them. And I want to make a very special thank you to the local organizing committee, to Tatiana and to Yuri, and to all of the students whose photos we saw on the screen yesterday, who have really made this possible and really have nurtured this largest RC21 conference ever with such care and attention and love, really. So thank you. And speaking of the local organizing committee and our presence here in Vienna, I would like to draw everyone's attention to the recently published, hot off the presses, virtual issue, a collection of essays and themes put together by the local organizing committee, specifically Michael Friesenecker and Tatiana and Yuri, for putting together. It's titled Vienna at a Crossroads, A Just City Under Pressure. It is available on the IJURR website, but also it's being circulated now through various social media channels. And I really encourage you to engage intellectually and deeply with the city that we're in and think about Red Vienna and think about the challenges of a just city under pressure. But my work today is to introduce our speaker for the IJURR lecture. It is a real pleasure to introduce Javier Auyero. Javier is the Joe R. and Teresa Lozano Long Professor of Latin American Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin and the founding director of the Urban Ethnography Lab there. His research, teaching, and writing have been central to the study of urban politics and marginality, and to the development and practice of ethnographic methods in the analysis of state power, violence, and everyday life at the urban margins. Across a remarkable body of work, including books such as Poor People's Politics, Contentious Lives, Routine Politics and Violence in Argentina, Patience of the State, Flammable, In Harm's Way, The Ambivalent State, Squatter Life, as well as edited volumes like Violence at the Urban Margins, Invisible in Austin, and Portraits of Persistence, Javier has offered textured, theoretically rich accounts of how poor and working class residents navigate clientelism, environmental suffering, and interpersonal and structural violence. His work has shaped how many of us here in this room think about urban marginality, political practice, and the everyday workings of the state, not only in Latin America, but in many contexts around the world. So please join me in welcoming Javier Auyero and thanking him for sharing his work today.
Thank you. I'm going to say it right at the end. This is very intimidating. I don't think I ever spoken in front of so many people, so just want to break the ice. And thank you, Liza, for that introduction. Thank you, Yuri, Alberta, Tatiana, Hannah, for the many emails, and publicly to Majo, who probably is responsible for me being here, but sadly who couldn't be with us today. The very last paragraph of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities reads like this: "The inferno of the living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what is already here, the inferno where we live every day, that we form by being together. There are two ways to escape suffering. The first is easy for many: accept the inferno and become such a part of it that you can no longer see it. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what in the midst of the inferno are not infernal. Then make them endure, give them space." So today I want to talk about one inferno, that of dark governance, and about our collective search for not infernos, both taking place at the same time in contemporary Latin America. For those of you who are having trouble with my accent, I've been living for 7 months now in Spain. The English will eventually come back to its regular form, but I'll try. So let me start with one vignette from Squatter Life, a book that I recently co-authored with Sofia Servian, an anthropologist who was born and raised in the neighborhood where we did our fieldwork. Elias is 29 years old, and he lives in La Matera, a squatter settlement in the southern part of metropolitan Buenos Aires. He grew up surrounded by the world of petty crime, drug use, and small-scale drug dealing. One of his brothers is in prison for robbery, another is currently in a drug treatment program. His two younger brothers, as he puts it, quote, "are already on drugs," end quote, and several of his closest friends sell drugs in the neighborhood. He used to spend most evenings on the corner outside his house with those friends, smoking weed, drinking cheap alcohol, and on more than one occasion selling Paco, which is a cheap derivative of cocaine. Elias knows that the sale of illicit drugs in his neighborhood, as in many other places, depends on police protection. Cops who collaborate with traffickers even have a name: narcopolicías. The police don't just sell protection, they also provide weapons and ammunition. Narcopolicías in Buenos Aires, paramilitaries in Colombia, vigilantes in the US-Mexico border, gangs in Ecuador and El Salvador, colectivos in Venezuela, dons in Jamaica, the Zetas in Mexico, los monos in Rosario, Argentina. Other than being violent specialists, that is, people who control means of inflicting damage on persons and objects, what do they have in common? All these groups, widely different in size, geographic scope, resources, and internal coherence, so different that some of you might be thinking, how can he even think about putting them in one group? But they all have clandestine, illicit relationships with state actors through which they exchange money, information, guns, and drugs. These links serve to exert power over people and places. That is, they do governance. Dark governance is a form of rule that emerges out of the maneuvers and arrangements that are often obscure and obscured. How do clandestine relationships manage to govern over individuals, groups, and territories? How and why do illicit activities end up strengthening the power of the state or some of the hands of the state? What's the relationship between dark and democratic governance? What main processes lie at the heart of this form of power? Now, to answer, this is me selling you my book. To answer these questions, the book that will soon come out, and I'm slightly anxious because it's my first non-ethnographic book, combines a periscopic and a microscopic approach. Based on detailed examinations of crime and human rights reports, newspaper accounts, and secondary literature, I take a very sort of panoramic view at the main actors involved and the impact of dark governance in the Americas. Based on a deep dive on court cases that contain wiretap conversations between drug dealers and state officials, I go granular on the inner dynamics of this form of rule. Now, we know that around the world, state authorities, criminal groups, and semi-legal violence specialists frequently establish clandestine relationships. The continuity, blurred lines, complicit convergence, interlacement, or intertwinement, and I'm citing a bunch of different authors here, between actors, state actors, political elites, and perpetrators of violence have been amply documented in a variety of past and contemporary cases across the world. Clandestine relationships are particularly consequential for understanding and explaining collective violence, from food and ethnic riots and violent partisan politics to armed insurgencies and underground markets. But I think we have yet to adequately describe and theorize the role of these relationships in the larger project of governance and the mechanisms at its core. The book describes the working of this form of governance with a twofold purpose. One is establishing actually the existence of the phenomenon, and second, achieving the epistemic clarity and productivity that any new analytic construct demands. But I also want to make a more substantive claim. The concept of dark governance allows us to rethink a common assumption that still dominates many study of contemporary politics, that the political order works in opposition to more or less organized criminal activity and or collective violence. I argue in the book, by way of empirical demonstration, that clandestine connections might indeed weaken the rule of law, and by extension, democracy, but paradoxically, they might also fortify governance capacities. Rather than weakening the state, as in, for example, many of the arguments that examine the corrupting influence of drug trafficking, illicit links between official authorities and criminal actors can actually strengthen certain hands of the state. Operating out of what Catherine Berderi calls the shadows of the state, relationships between public authorities, elected officials, members of security agencies, etc., and criminal groups effectively regulate citizen behaviors in 5 areas: in the political field, in the market of criminalized drugs, in urban space, and in rural territories. 4. We find these surreptitious connections, sorry for the small font, 5, political fields, as when clandestine connections serve to finance electoral campaigns, mobilize voters, launder money, crush collective protests, surveil, intimidate, and or physically eliminate political opponents and social activists. We find these connections in the markets of criminalized drugs, as when clandestine relationships serve to buy and transport drugs, supply drug dealers with key material and symbolic resources, from legal tender to guns, ammunition, information, for their business, and physically remove competitors. We find these connections in urban space, as when clandestine relationships serve to administer public safety, regulate, either reduce or increment petty crime and interpersonal violence, evict informal vendors to accommodate infrastructure renewal projects, distribute public goods, resolve disputes, and informally tax residents. We find them in rural territories, as when clandestine relationships start to displace peasants to make room for large-scale development projects or new extractive activities. And last, we find them in transnational spaces, as when clandestine relationships serve to regulate migration flows. I don't know if he's here, but the recent work of Luigi Achilli, who examines the involvement of transnational criminal organizations in migration control policies in Libya and Greece, is particularly illustrative in this regard. So insofar as they impose rules and restrictions on the behavior of others, residents of marginalized communities, peasants, activists, traffickers, clandestine connections do governance. Given that these relationships are secret and or illicit, I call this dark governance. And so that we're not talking about abstract or theoretical, let's go to take the case of the Chone Killers, which is the main criminal organization in Durán, a municipality of 300,000 in the southwest coastal province of Guayas, in Guayaquil, Ecuador. That's the main commercial port, which has become the epicenter of violence in Latin America. Let me highlight a key issue. The Chone Killers play a major role in highly profitable urban land trafficking, operating with the complicity of certain local authorities. These gangs don't just act from the outside. They infiltrate municipal institutions and then use the access to their advantage. Once inside, they are able to A, secure lucrative public work contracts, B, legalize property deeds, C, identify new areas of development that they can exploit. They also take advantage of residents who lack basic public services, such as access to water, using the vulnerability as leverage. In addition, they collect bribes and use their influence to shape local decisions for their own benefit. Since we are in an urban conference, let me speak about urban space, and let's now move to El Salvador and to the 2014 electoral campaign. At the moment, now President Bukele was the rising star of Salvadoran politics. Behind the scenes, he and his closest advisors were striking secret pacts with gangs. Why? So that he could safely campaign inside neighborhoods controlled by the Maras. And those agreements weren't just symbolic. Payments reached tens of thousands of dollars just to ensure that his candidacy wasn't sabotaged. Once Bukele became mayor, those covert arrangements didn't stop. MS-13 members and state officials kept the deals alive, clearing the way for his two flagship initiatives that many argue are central in his winning the presidency: the reconstruction of San Salvador's Centro Histórico and the opening of the Cuscatlán market. Now, in return for not obstructing these urban renewal projects, Bukele's municipal administration handed out street vendors, stalls, and market spaces to gang leaders, and even hired gang members to provide security at government-sponsored events and festivals. And so here is the crucial point. Those clandestine relationships didn't just end when Bukele reached the presidency, they continue. What I want to emphasize, just with two examples, and there are many more, is this: we should think about dark governance not as a set of isolated actions, but as what Norbert Elias used to call a figuration. In other words, it is a web of social and political relationships created by all the actors involved, and this is what distinguishes dark governance from criminal governance. It is the totality of their interactions, what Elias used to call a flexible lattice of tensions and shifts as they engage with one another. And what's the key feature of this figuration? A constantly fluctuating balance of power. So when I talk about dark governance, I'm pointing to something quite specific: this subterranean line of action running through contemporary political life. It's not random. It emerges out of recurrent clandestine relationships that begin to follow certain regularities. They form a pattern that is coherent, that is intelligible, even if it is always, and I want to emphasize this, improvised and always locally negotiated. Let me give you one example of the hundreds I read in court cases. And for those of you who were here yesterday, this is not big data, okay? No, I don't do that, okay? My analysis is based on a close and systematic reading of 53 criminal cases in which state agents were prosecuted for crimes related to collusion with drug market groups in Argentina, often on charges of conspiracy, bribery, and extortion between 2013 and 2023. This is a wiretap call, but this is very simple stuff, right? Wiretap call, a police officer quietly warns a trafficker, looks like they are about to raid your place, clean house, wipe your phones. Just a clarification, these are not conversations between drug dealers. These are conversations between drug dealers and members of the state, right? A single line, but it reveals an entire, always working, always about to collapse, according to my analysis of these transcripts, world. Another example, this is a police officer talking with the head of a drug dealing group in a province in Argentina, in the Patagonia. When I need something from you, you're always there. This is mutual. We are here for one another. Another officer informs the main dealer about an imminent federal investigation on his network and adds, I tell you this because we are friends. You are blood of my own blood, sangre de mi sangre, because oftentimes you help me, and now I want to help you. Tellingly, in referring to the officers with whom they are colluding, the narcopolicías, the main dealer and his associate use the language of kinship. Anthropologists love that. In many a phone conversation, he reminds his closest associate that this was Sunday, time to pay our relatives. So this shows that trust building is a key mechanism in the daily making of dark governance. And there are many other mechanisms, such as signaling, brokering, undergrounding, that I don't have time to go over them now. Ethnographic research has documented how central neighborhood, friendship, and family networks are in the recruitment of street dealers, and in the operation of the drug business. We know from the work of Philippe Bourgois, Randall Contreras, and Dennis Rogers, many people who know that they are, friends and family, the dealers. But friendship, kinship, and neighborhood ties also link individuals engaged in criminal activities with members of the security forces. In other words, our analysis shows that cops and dealers are oftentimes neighbors, friends, and relatives. These concrete, ongoing relationships between traffickers and state officers are responsible for producing much of the trust needed in illicit practices. Now, crucially, I think we can see dark governance. It becomes visible when we track concrete, intentional decisions made by real actors on the ground. Politicians, bureaucrats, police officers, traffickers, gang members, all of them are calculating, coordinating, plotting, pursuing advantages. There is no real, from my reading of these transcripts, there is no shortage of strategy here. But, and I think this is the key point, the larger consequences of these very intentional, very localized decisions are not centrally directed. So as far as I can tell, there's no single actor pulling the strings and designing the overall outcome. So what we end up with is a governing logic that emerges from these interactions without being planned by any one planner. So to borrow and adapt from both Foucault and Bourdieu, we can talk about dark governance as a strategy without a strategist. Now, there is certainly plenty to investigate, and the book is only the beginning. I think it's a sort of invitation. But let me now move, and I know I'm trying to do two things in one talk, which is not advisable for anybody looking for a job, but I have one, so I can do that. So let me now move to the not infernos. In Reversible Destiny, this classic study of the Palermitan mafia, Jane and Peter Schneider describe the intreccio. Did I say that right, Alberta? Yes? The ceaseless intertwining between state and organized crime, and examine the genesis and relative success of the anti-mafia movement, the way in which joint, sustained, and organized, both capillary and publicly, collective action may thwart brutal force. Yes, they say it was difficult. Yes, it suffered many drawbacks. Yes, it was risky, But they show that collective action actually worked. And that it worked in part because it managed to transcend deep, well-established ideological divisions. When civil society actors, neighborhood groups, grassroots organizations, and larger social movements establish working relationships with those pieces of the state, they say, the fight against state crime clandestine relationships can actually be impactful. If we are to confront dark governance, I think we should learn from those Italian activists, state officials and citizens who jointly fought against the mafiosi and the intreccio. They showed us a way out. But this is not just wishful thinking. This is not just based on one case. Scores of social movements, past and present, have also shown that collective action matters. And this leads me straight into our current project, which we call it Things That Work. And this project, and now I'm really on unknown territory for me, or sort of unknown. This project started, and I didn't realize at the time, in Medellin, Colombia. I remember climbing the very steep hills of the Comuna 8. I had arrived there thanks to a group of professors and students from the University of Antioquia who had invited me to participate in an ethnography workshop in August 2023. It was my first visit to the city. After the workshop, you know, Colombians, I don't know if anybody is here, at least people from Medellin, they like to plan every single minute of your stay there, and it is exhausting. But they took me around the neighborhood. We visited a public library in the Comuna 8, an ecological garden, a center where women organize against gender violence, and a collective of young people dedicated to music production. The challenges residents face in the Comuna 8 were immediately visible. People who live amid environmental hazards, material deprivation, state violence, and the lingering presence of paramilitary power. But what struck me was that my host kept directing my attention somewhere else. Literally. They would say, you know, as a sociologist, I've spent much of my career studying the production and reproduction of suffering, marginalization, social domination. Yet the students and neighborhood activists wanted me to focus on not on what was wrong, but on what they were building. They would say things like, look, the bookshelves will go here once we finish paving the floor. Or look at this lettuce. We grow it without chemicals. Or with this small mill, I'm quoting, we are generating some of our own energy. Again and again during the entire day, they shifted my gaze, literally, like, look here, right? Toward the practical work of creating better lives under conditions they did not control. That evening, I wrote in my field diary that they had pointed me towards a question I knew much less about than the topics I had spent years studying. Not reproduction of marginality, not the perpetration of violence, not the mechanisms of domination, but something very different. What makes grassroots initiatives persist over time and succeed? They were pointing towards what we call things that work, cosas que funcionan. Now, in marginalized urban and rural areas across Latin America, community organizations work every day to make life more livable, to make it less precarious, less violent, healthier, more dignified. They run food banks, rehab programs, agroecological gardens. They organize women's collectives against interpersonal violence. They mobilize to combat environmental degradation. Many of these organizations persist for years, even decades. And yet, we know surprisingly little about the social dynamics that sustain them. What allows them to endure? What are the mechanisms that explain their persistence? So persistence is the focus of this project. Now, social scientists, all of us collectively, have produced an enormous body of research on urban protests and social movements. We know a great deal about how collective action emerges, develops, sometimes succeeds. We understand the importance of resources, of networks. How many lit reviews we need that shows networks, organizations, political opportunities, and cultural frames and emotions. We know that, right? but we know much less about what happens after demonstrations end, after the excitement fades, after the cameras leave. What remains when the heat of collective action cools down? In many places, what remains are organizations that continue to provide food, housing, care, protection, education, and community to people at the bottom of the social order. And that raises, I think, a fundamental question. Beyond commitment and determination, what relational dynamics keep these efforts, what Bourdieu would call these little social miracles, alive? Now, together with a group of, how many are they? 11 colleagues and grad students, we're studying a diverse set of initiatives across Latin America. One of them, Tomás Capalvo, is studying Vientos de Libertad in Argentina, which is an organization that supports highly marginalized people confronting substance abuse by creating pathways towards recovery and community reintegration. Another one, Daniela Sanchez, is studying a feminist network of activists in Mexico that provide information, accompaniment, and care for people seeking autonomous, self-managed abortions. And then there is Pepaso, who sadly, Majo is not here, but she studies these community organizations that have provided food. Majo Alvarez, for those of you, for me, Majo is a friend, but Majo Alvarez is studying a community organization that has provided food, education, care in low-income neighborhoods for more than 4 decades. Now, these initiatives, and there are many more, differ in their goals, their constituencies, and their histories. But they also share something important. Across all of them, activists engage with the state. Now, sometimes the engagement is cooperative, other times is openly confrontational. In some cases, they seek material resources to sustain their work. In others, they demand protection for a territory, the defense of a way of life, the implementations of laws the state has failed to enforce. The relationship between the state is rarely straightforward. It is oftentimes a negotiation, a sort of wrestle. And that recurring engagement reminds us something fundamental. They are not simply charitable or community groups. They are deeply political collective efforts sustained through ongoing interactions with institutions of power. And understanding how they persist means understanding those relationships as well as the internal social dynamics that allows them to survive and sometimes flourish over time. Now, what else do these very, very different initiatives have in common? Across all of them, we see activists constantly reaching beyond their own organizations to build relationships with others. They form partnerships, coalitions, collaborations with actors who are outside the initiative itself. They work with state agencies at the local, provincial, national levels. They engage with NGOs, churches, universities, social movement organizations, at times international institutions. Those relationships are not peripheral to their success, they're central to it. They help grassroots organizations secure resources, gain visibility, expand their reach, strengthen their capacity to serve their communities. Put simply, initiatives endure because they are embedded in a wider network of support, cooperation, and sometimes contention. Another common feature they have in common concerns membership. In every case, and again, these are very different initiatives, there is a core group of committed participants who keep the organization running day after day, but these initiatives also depend on many others who participate more intermittently. What is striking, and we found out after 11 ethnographic cases, is how flexible they are in defining who belongs. Membership is rarely a rigid category. The boundary between insiders and outsiders is often very porous, and this flexibility really does matter. It helps prevent burnout among the most committed activists, and it allows people to contribute according to their own possibilities and circumstances. And it accommodates different levels of engagement without forcing people to choose between being fully in or completely out. One participant in the Mesa del Agua in Colombia told Maria Dávila, "I may not attend every meeting, but I still feel part of this group." Now, that simple statement could have been made by participants in almost every other initiative we studied. That sense of flexible belonging expands the reach of these organizations. It helps transform what might begin as an individual problem a family without potable water, for example, into a shared concern, a collective grievance, and ultimately a collective project. In other words, flexible participation plays a crucial role in turning private troubles into public issues. Another common element is the development of expertise. As people participate in these organizations, they do not simply volunteer their time, they acquire knowledge, they learn skills, they develop competencies. They learn how to manage a drug rehab program, how to accompany someone through a safe abortion, how to cultivate food without pesticides, how to recover and identify the remains of the disappeared. Over time, participants become experts in practice that are essential to the well-being of their communities. What is particularly interesting or striking is that this expertise often operates in a sort of double movement. On the one hand, it challenges established hierarchies of knowledge, demonstrating ordinary people do possess valuable forms of practical understanding. On the other hand, this knowledge frequently develops through interaction with professionals, state agencies, universities, and other expert institutions. And as participants accumulate this expertise, they become trusted and legitimate actors in their communities, helping them to persist. People whose judgment carries weight and whose actions inspire confidence. And again, I don't know if she's here, but the recent work of Guya Acornero on the housing movement in Portugal makes this point much better than I just did. Now, let me turn now to begin to end to a question that fascinated us throughout the project, which is, what does participation in these initiatives actually feel like? As I was telling the class the other day, when was it, Sunday? Who was on Sunday? Was it Sunday class? Yeah, Sunday. I came to the affect turn a little bit late, and so I'm now trying to attune. So how does it feel to be part of these initiatives? After all, the organizations we were studying operate in very, very different political, economic, and cultural settings. Their goals vary enormously, and yet we keep hearing remarkably similar stories from their participants. Whether activists are feeding a child, caring for a neighbor, helping someone recover from addiction, organizing against an extractive project, accompanying someone seeking an abortion, cleaning a polluted river, building a neighborhood library, or identifying the remains of a disappeared person, these activities seem to generate comparable moral and emotional rewards. And again, people describe experiences of connection and collective achievement. One activist from El Algarrobo, which is a movement opposing large-scale mining in Andalgalá in Argentina, captured this dynamic beautifully in an interview with Alison Lang, when she said, "There are people with whom, honestly, I never imagined I would have anything in common. And yet, there is a higher good, the care of our common home, that brought us together. People as different as we are sit down, talk, and try to smooth our difference because what matters is not the small things that separate us, but the things that unite us." I was personally struck by how often we encounter some version of this sentiment across our cases. People talk about walking together, and walking together, they told us, create what they call a welcoming atmosphere, a space of care, a place where people feel seen, recognized, valued. Or as participants in Pepaso told Majo, something that you fall in love with. I know now it's really sounding romantic and populist, and I've been trained not to do that, so a Mexican feminist activist summed up a feeling we encounter repeatedly when she told Daniela Sanchez, "It's truly a joy to be able to help." Now, what is remarkable sociologically for me is that these feelings are not necessarily what participants bring with them when they join. Rather, these feelings are generated and intensified through the work they do together. That is, the action itself produces the emotions that sustain the action. Their participation gives them recognition, pride, pleasure. And if we read between the lines, between the ethnographic interviews, we can detect something even deeper, a shared sense of personal and collective efficacy, a feeling that together they can make some sort of difference. And I was reminded, this reminded me of a sociological insight Doug McCarran made many years ago when he wrote Freedom Summer. He wrote that the most satisfying selves we will ever know are those that attach to communities and purposes larger than ourselves. Now let me, again, begin to end with an important clarification. I will be the last person to claim that we are the first ones interested in understanding enduring forms of collective action. I recently, and again, I'm new to RC21, so I don't know if she's here or not. Chiara Cacciotti's work on IJURRs, published on Squatters in Rome. You're not here, are you? No? Anyway, although that work, and I don't know her, but it emerges from a very different theoretical tradition. It raises strikingly similar questions about the conditions that allow collective efforts to endure over time. I will also point to, I know she's here because I saw her, Francesca Ferlica's research on community-led climate action in the Union of Colonies of San Miguel Teotongo in Mexico City. It's a very similar project, or the work of Katie Sovereign on worker cooperatives in Argentina. Or, I know she's here because I just talked to her, Melissa Garcia Lamarcas on the PAO, the platform, and la Plataforma Afectados por la Hipoteca. They're very similar, sort of, again, from very different theoretical tradition, very similar substantive efforts to make sense of what persists over time. If you take that body of work together, what they are doing is inviting us to shift our attention slightly. Not away from urban protest, contention, and resistance, but towards a different question. How do ordinary people build organizations that last? How do they transform collective hopes into durable institutions of care, solidarity, and action? And what can we learn from those rare but vital cases when grassroots efforts do not merely emerge, but persist? Now, let me do conclude. In Poverty by America, Matt Desmond writes that when we refuse to recognize what works, we risk swallowing the lie that nothing does. We risk imagining the future only as more of the same. We risk giving into despair, perhaps the most exculpating of all emotions, and submitting to cynicism, perhaps the most conservative of all belief systems. Now, perhaps my own growing interest in studying things that work began as a way of pushing back against my own creeping cynicism. Perhaps it emerged from a need to find light, or at least to learn to notice it, in places and practices that my sociological training had long encouraged me to approach with a lot of skepticism. Like many of us, I was trained to be wary of romanticizing everyday life, to resist reading every popular initiative as resistance and every collective effort as insurgency or as emancipation. And yet, I have come to believe that there is much to explore there. So this brief discussion of the ongoing project is really a sort of invitation. An invitation I would love to leave with you today. An invitation to study not only breakdowns, failures, exclusions, and forms of alienation, but also efforts, relationships, institutions that succeed, however imperfectly, in improving people's lives. Not because such cases offer comfort in difficult times, although perhaps they do, but because they provide a crucial window into the dynamics and long-term consequences of collective action. I think they do help us to understand how ordinary people come together to confront marginalization, build alternatives, and create conditions in which dignity, security, and hope becomes possible. Now, if we pay closer attention to what works, we may sharpen our understanding of how meaningful social change actually takes root and endure. Now to conclude, really, I think I said that 4 times, but one might see these 2 projects, dark governance and things that work, as pointing into 2 very different opposing directions. One examining suffering, violence, and domination, the other one exploring successful collective efforts and possibilities of change. They might appear to embody what Gramsci used to call the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. But I prefer to think of them as inseparable. And here let me truly end with a literary reference. It's an occupational hazard because I'm married to a writer. In El Cuarto de Atrás, the Spanish novelist Carmen Martín Gaite describes writing as a practice that moves constantly between understanding the world as it is and imagining the world as it could be. I think that description captures for me what sociology at its best can do. It is a craft that moves back and forth between explanation and imagination, between documenting social realities and envisioning possibilities beyond them. It is in that productive tension between understanding the world and contributing, however modestly, to its transformation that I continue to find both intellectual purpose and political hope. Thank you.